I want to welcome everyone and hope you all had a really good Memorial Day weekend. I'm Carol Kowalski. I'm the Assistant Town Manager for Development for the town of Lexington. And Lexington was the first town to adopt the MBTA multifamily zoning, thanks to some of my staff who you see here. I want to say that without taking too much time, Jim Kelly, our building commissioner, and I were having a conversation, and we realized that since we had to date had so little multifamily, we weren't as familiar with the special requirements for accessibility that multifamily requires. And I was fortunate to find Kathryn Denis, a senior associate with KMA Architecture and Accessibility online. And we were delighted that she's presenting today. And there will be a lot of information given. This will be recorded, and we'll make sure that the recording is available on the internet. Katie will also describe how you can get AICP certificate maintenance credit for this presentation. So I'm going to just turn this over to Katie. Thank you so much.
Yeah, awesome. Welcome, everyone. And as Carol just mentioned, if you're attending today to get AICP CM credits, you must attend the entire event in order to receive those credits. And I'd like to ask if you would like those credits to please use the sign-in sheet and the evaluation form that are linked in the chat, so we know you were here today. So you can fill those out either during the conference or after at your leisure. So here's the agenda today. We're going to go through a little bit about why accessibility is important, the applicable codes and standards, a whole bunch of requirements, and then at the end of the session, we'll have a Q&A session. So I have everyone on mute now because there's a lot of people. If you have questions that come up as I'm going through these slides, please put them in the chat and we'll go through as many as we can get through during the Q&A portion. So KMA is a design and consulting practice. This is us. And we work in accessibility. That's it. That's all we do. All day, every day. We don't do life safety code. We don't do egress code. It's just accessibility. Some of the services we provide are planning, existing conditions audit, plan reviews, construction walks, design services, and all these other things. So today, I'll start with why is accessibility important? And the first is, if I asked you all if we were in a room together, whether you identify as a person with a disability or someone with a disability, I imagine everyone would raise their hand. That's because 1 in 4 adults in Massachusetts identify as a person with a disability. And disability is such a broad spectrum. It can be mobility impairments, it can be hearing loss, vision loss, cognitive, a whole bunch of different things. And it can impact someone, whether it's through age, injury, illness. It can be permanent, it can be temporary. It's a whole broad spectrum that really touches everyone on this planet at some point in their lives. Accessibility laws and regulations first came into play starting in World War II. And the first fact I always like to put on these slides is penicillin. Penicillin was first introduced during World War II and allowed a lot of soldiers to come home who otherwise would not have. And these soldiers were coming home with injuries, illness, disability, so much so that they formed a group called the PVA, the Paralyzed Vets of America. And this group is still active today and was one of the fundamental sources in the disability rights movement to pass the first accessibility laws and regulations. You'll notice a lot of the regulations occurred around 1968, including the Architectural Barriers Act and 521 CMR, your state accessibility requirements. That's around the same time as the civil rights movement. And then subsequently, we had Section 504, the Fair Housing Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we will get into momentarily. So those are kind of the moral obligations of why accessibility is important, right? It touches everyone's lives. There's this long history surrounding it, but we find what drives a lot of accessibility can actually be litigation and investigations. There's a lot of different advocacy groups and organizations out there testing for accessibility, and failure to design and construct a building according to accessibility codes is considered discrimination. It's considered discriminating against people with disabilities. I've included some of those advocacy groups here, mostly Massachusetts-based, but a few national as well. We have Mass Fair Housing, Greater Boston Legal Services, Equal Rights Center, DREDF, the Disability Law Center, the Boston Center for Independent Living, and Project Civic Access, which is sponsored by the Department of Justice, and it's an agency that tests municipalities for accessibility. And I just clipped some of their more recent Massachusetts litigations. So why do errors occur in accessibility compliance? The first is because there's a bunch of confusing and overlapping accessibility requirements. There's also design errors and construction errors. Designing to maximum and minimum dimensions is a frequent and common issue we see. Installed appliances or fixtures differ from what is shown in the drawing. So you'll have a deeper fridge or a deeper toilet, and that's going to affect your clearances. And unforeseen field conditions. And we'll kind of go through a few examples of these. And before I get really into the meat of the presentation, I'm sharing all of this not because I'm expecting you to learn all of the dimensional and code requirements today, but instead to put these ideas in your brain space so that maybe when you have a project in your town or wherever you are, you may ask the question, what about accessibility? You'll remember back to this PowerPoint, hopefully, and go, hey, Katie said something about toilets or sinks, and let me look back on this presentation, or let me reach out to one of the resources she gave, so that you can avoid these types of errors. So let's start with multiple codes and standards. So in Massachusetts, we have 521 CMR. 521 CMR is part of our building code. It is enforceable by the Massachusetts Architectural Access Board and local building officials. And it does have a process for applying for a request for a variance when not in compliance. In order to receive a variance, you have to prove technical and feasibility or significant cost without substantial benefit to people with disabilities. So it's a pretty high standard to get a variance, and it goes through the board. They review the application and can ask for follow-up, all that. So, you know, I share this because it's not as easy as just, oh, we'll get a variance. It is an involved process. But there are a few typical variances we see in multifamily projects, and that includes Group 1 sink depths. Currently, the regulations require sinks to be 6.5 inches deep in all your units, but most projects choose not to install those shallow sinks and instead some deeper sinks, but it requires a variance. And electrical outlets at glass window walls. So if you have a project where there's a glass window wall and the outlets underneath the wall can't be within reach range, that's a common variance we see as well. Relative to multifamily, it applies to new construction as well as renovations. For renovations, you have to look at the overall cost of the project and the scope of work to determine where and how 521 CMR applies, and you can look at Chapter 3 for those requirements. It applies to common use areas and units. It does not apply to employee spaces. And relative to the units, there's two different types. There's Group 1 units and Group 2A units. So Group 2A units are your more accessible units, and it applies to 5% of the total number of units in a project with more than 20 dwelling units. And these units have to be distributed by number of bedroom, size, quality, price, and location. And then the rest of your units would have to be group 1, which have less stringent layout requirements, but still do have a set of requirements to make them more adaptable to people with disabilities. The next code that applies to multifamily projects in Mass would be the ADA. It's a federal civil rights law. It's enforceable by the Department of Justice. And as we said earlier, failure to design and construct per the ADA is considered discrimination. In multifamily projects, the ADA only applies to areas considered places of public accommodation. So it doesn't typically apply to the units or to areas open exclusively to residents and their guests. However, it does apply to the leasing office because that's a place of public accommodation. And when I think about it, it's like any place I could go just walking off the street, right? Like I could go to the sale and leasing office and potentially rent an apartment. Therefore, the ADA applies to that space and any associated toilets, employee break rooms, or parking. If there's any retail in your multifamily project or business spaces, the ADA would also apply there. And also it applies from at the route from the street to the leasing office. So those are the kind of the main areas that the ADA applies. The other big accessibility requirement in Massachusetts is the Fair Housing Act, which is a federal civil rights law that provides protection from discrimination when renting or buying a home or an apartment. And there's several protected categories per the Fair Housing Act, including people with disabilities. It's enforced by HUD, and to ensure you're not discriminating against people with disabilities, you have to design and construct your projects to meet a certain standard per the FHA. So the design and construction requirements of the FHA apply to new construction after March 13th of 1991 to projects with 4 or more units. With an elevator, it's all the units in the project. If it's not an elevated building, it would only be the ground floor units. And to meet the design and construction requirements, you have to choose one of 15 recognized safe harbors. In Massachusetts, we generally recommend following the Fair Housing Act Design Manual because it most closely aligns with 521 CMR, your state accessibility code. The design and construction requirements do not apply to multi-story townhouse units without an elevator, carriage house units, which are units with a garage underneath, alterations or renovations to a property built prior to 1991. And there's 7 main requirements in the design manual: an accessible building entrance, common use in public areas, usable doors, accessible routes through units, controls in locations that are accessible, reinforcing in the bathrooms, and usable kitchen and bathrooms. And we'll get into these a little more detailed in a bit. So to summarize, in Massachusetts, we have the FHA that applies when there's 4 or more units to all covered units, and the MAB or 521 CMR that also applies to 5% of the units for group 2 if there's more than 20 dwelling units, and the rest would be group 1. The only exception being, again, elevated buildings, all units are covered. If there's no elevator, it's just the ground floor. And then the ADA also applies to areas open to the public, such as the leasing office or any retail spaces. So, with all that in mind, one of the most common errors we see is early on in the design phases. Here's an example of an electric outlet that in the drawings was located incorrectly, and then when it was built, it was also located incorrectly. So we highly recommend doing plan review and vetting your teams to ensure they're thinking about accessibility early and often. We also see things constructed incorrectly, and this photo makes me chuckle. I was on a site recently where there was a ramp that was a little bit too steep, and everyone brought out their smart level to compare notes. And it turned out the smart levels that the contractors were using were in degrees and not percent. And that's why their slopes were coming in wrong at their ramp. Tolerances are something that get brought up frequently in multifamily construction. And Massachusetts is one of the only codes that has tolerances built in. So I've listed them here from 521 CMR. So an example is when you have a dimension between 0 and 2 inches, you have an 1/8 inch of tolerance in either direction. It's important to note that these tolerances do not apply to minimum or maximum dimensions. And that's because, you know, the AAB is assuming the minimum and maximum are already giving you a pretty good range. And the other thing to note is tolerances don't apply to the FHA or ADA, which both reference that tolerances exist, but neither define them like 521 CMR does. Some projects choose to use these tolerances as kind of a risk management strategy, but it's project dependent, and the black and white of the code says this would only apply for 521 CMR things and not FHA or ADA. Another common error we see are different appliances being spec'd and installed than what is drawn in the drawings. So here's an example of, in the drawings, they show a fridge providing the required 40 inches of clearance. However, the spec'd appliance is only providing 36 when installed and creating an issue. So it's important to, again, review all these things at the initial project phase, as well as throughout the project to ensure compliance. The next common error we see is unforeseen field conditions. So these are things that come up during construction that just weren't thought about in the planning stage, but still can create issues. So here's an example of a door maneuvering clearance where they have it to the stud, but they were actually required to add another layer of wallboard for fire rating. And then once they added that extra layer of wallboard, they no longer had the clearances. So these, again, are things to think about as you're looking at your projects of all these potential places for error. The last thing I wanted to talk about before I get into, what's required where is affordable housing. So I know a lot of the MBTA communities are also looking at affordability, and there are different triggers depending on the type of project for accessibility when it comes to affordability. So if the project is part of a local government program, such as a local housing authority, it's required to comply with the 2010 ADA standards at the unit portion. So I know I just said the ADA applies to the leasing and public areas, but if it's affordable and part of local government, it also would apply to the units and amenity spaces. Similarly, Section 504 of the Rehab Act of 1973 applies if the project is receiving federal financial assistance. Section 504 says you can either comply with UFAS or the 2010 ADA standards. And generally, we find a lot of projects are required to comply with both here, Section 504 and Title II of the ADA. So therefore, we recommend following the 2010 ADA when affordability requirements are tripped. The major differences here, though, are not huge, because you already have a pretty stringent base code in Massachusetts. The major differences include the reach range is reduced to 48 inches if you're following the ADA standards. Both UFAS and the ADA standards require work surface in the kitchen, which is not required by 521 CMR or the FHA. And they both have different bathing fixture controls than required by 521 CMR or the FHA. So those are things just to keep in mind, but generally the layouts align with the layouts of a Group 2 unit. They have to have a lot of similar features. So those are some things to keep in mind. So let's get into some of these requirements. So let's start with common use and amenity spaces. So the first is walkways and sidewalks. 521 CMR requires all walkways and all entrances to be accessible. This is surprising to many projects in Massachusetts. So I'm saying it here so you can have this information. If you have a walkway or an entrance that cannot be made accessible, it is potential to receive a variance for that condition. But again, you either have to prove technical infeasibility or significant cost without substantial benefit to people with disabilities. If stairs are used on a site, an adjacent accessible walkway or a variance is required. So I know in Massachusetts, things get hilly. Just anytime you see a stair, make sure you're putting an adjacent accessible route to it. The accessible route has a 5% maximum running slope and 2% maximum cross slope with very few exceptions. It has to be minimum 48 inches wide, and it includes curb ramps. So 521 CMR and the ADA standards have a whole set of requirements for curb ramps that should be looked at early and often. The last bullet here I'm putting is PROAG. So PROAG is the Public Rights of Way Accessibility Guidelines that has been passed by the Federal Access Board, and I believe is waiting on Congress or someone to memorialize it to make it enforceable. So currently it's not fully enforceable, but it is coming. And the reason I'm sharing this is because this standard has significant impacts on the public rights of way and sidewalks in municipalities and at multifamily housing projects. The other thing I'll note is PROAG is currently referenced in MassDOT's design standards. So if you're doing any MassDOT sidewalks or work, you should be already looking at PROAG, and if not, this is a good nudge to start doing so. So the accessible route or right of way, as I mentioned, has to meet certain slope requirements. And again, all walkways have to be accessible. So here on the bottom left, you'll see there is a walkway that has the correct slope. So it's 4.5% running slope and 0.5% cross slope. So that is good. But on the right-hand side, there's another walkway that has some significant cross slope issues. And cross slope is if I were walking down a sidewalk, putting my slope tool down, so that little yellow 2-foot level, if I put that down in the perpendicular direction, that would give me my cross slope. And if I put it down in the parallel direction to the direction I'm walking, that would give me my running slope. So here in that top right picture, we see a sidewalk with some significant cross slopes as well as a stair with no adjacent accessible route. So that would not be permitted in Massachusetts. Accessible routes give you a lot of exposure on a project because they are visible to anyone driving on the property, visiting the property. It's a really obvious place for error, and it's a common place for litigation because it is so easy to see. Accessible routes have to have a floor surface that is stable, firm, and slip resistant. So here are 3 images of surfaces that do not meet any of those. So grass does not count as a stable, firm, and slip resistant surface. Neither does mulch or rocks. It has to be something like concrete or paper patio, something that, you know, won't sink or squish or slip. And then here are just a few examples of things I've seen in the field of non-accessible routes. So in the top left, there's a picture of a pool. Pool decks are a common area we see cross slope issues. So the cross slope again has to be maximum 2%. And a lot of times pool decks also are thinking about using slopes for drainage. And that can create potential conflicts with the accessibility requirements. So again, thinking about this early and often, reviewing your pools, reviewing your drainage, making sure there's no cross slopes is critical. And then on the bottom left, there's a bocce court, and the route to it is grass. So that would not constitute a stable, firm, and slip-resistant surface. So you would have to think of either paving that or creating a way to get to that bocce court that doesn't require traversing the grass. Accessible parking is another area that really impacts a lot of our multifamily projects. 521 CMR for multifamily, Chapter 10 says all parking spaces have to be capable of being made accessible at tenant request in the future. So where that really comes into play and really impacts projects is when you're in the early design phases, you have to be thinking about your garage, because with that requirement, any space in that garage could potentially be made a van space and needs 8'2" vertical clearance. If you can't provide 8'2" vertical clearance in your garage, you could potentially apply for a variance by providing that 8'2" in some spaces, but maybe not all of it. We also recommend at the start following 521 CMR 23.2.1, which establishes minimum numbers of accessible parking spaces, just so you start off with some set amount of spaces, as opposed to trying to fit them in later at tenant request. FHA requires 2% of each type of parking to be made accessible. The last thing to note about parking is it's categorized by use. So if in your garage you have some residential spaces and some visitor spaces and some leasing spaces, you would have to do your accessible parking counts for each of those uses. It's not a cumulative count unless they all can share all the spaces. EV charging stations are another hot button item we see come up frequently in Massachusetts. There's currently no requirement to have an accessible EV parking space. However, you do need to have an EV charger on a minimum 36-inch wide accessible route, an adjacent level 30 by 48 clear floor space at the controls, have controls within reach range, and have controls that are operable with one hand without tight grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist. So in the bottom, you'll see an example of a picture of a compliant EV charging station where you'll notice they've striped a 36-inch wide route to get to the station from the parking space. And then at the charging station itself, there is a 30 by 48 clear floor space. There are several funding sources in Massachusetts that I'm aware of that are going above and beyond this requirement. I believe Article 80 in Boston, there's certain EV charging credits you can get that would also require an accessible space for an EV charging. So it's important to look at the funding sources and the different zoning requirements for EV charging, because this may go above and beyond the minimum accessibility requirements. Playgrounds. So in Massachusetts, an accessible route is required to and around the play equipment. Engineered wood fiber is not considered a stable, firm, and slip-resistant surface per the MAB. So the AAB has a long history of reviewing playground surfaces, and they've established since the 90s that engineered wood fiber is not an acceptable surface. Instead, surfaces like pour-in-place rubber or grass mats are compliant. This is surprising to many. I know there's many playgrounds out there, many playground manufacturers still putting this wood fiber surface in Massachusetts, but it is not permitted. If you're at a project that has a playground open to the public, not just residents and their guests, the ADA standards also has additional requirements for the play equipment itself. So I'm just noting that here because, you know, depending on the project, the ADA may apply, and they have more stringent requirements about the equipment, requiring things like transfer stations, ramps, elevated play components, ground play components, etc. Trash in multifamily. So you're going to see a common theme throughout this presentation is controls have to be operable with one hand without tight grasping, pinching, twisting of the wrist, and within an accessible reach range. That's a pretty standard requirement for any controls intended to be used by residents. So you should be ensuring whatever type of trash system you have, if it's intended to be operated by residents, the controls are operable and within reach range. So a lot of times we'll see in these trash rooms and multi-level elevated buildings, kind of this trash chute system. And these trash chute systems sometimes require you to push and hold a button as well as turn and pull the handle. And that would not be compliant because it requires more than one hand to operate. So thinking about trash and your trash systems in your project early and often is advisable. The entry intercom. This is another area, another control that has to be within reach range. If it's serving the leasing office, it has to be maximum 48 inches to the highest operable part. So in the bottom right, you'll see a photo where I have a green arrow pointing to where the 48-inch dimension is at the middle of the touch screen. So this would not be considered compliant because it's serving the leasing office, and the top of that touch screen, where there are some buttons, is higher than 48. In addition, you should have a level 30 by 48 clear floor space at any controls intended to be used by residents. That 30 by 48 dimension is the approximate size of a wheelchair. You'll hear it often throughout this presentation. And it is required to be adjacent to controls so you can kind of park and use whatever controls it's serving. Mailboxes. So mailboxes in Massachusetts have to be maximum 54 inches to the center line of the highest operable lock. This is surprising to many. I know this is not done on every project in Massachusetts, but it is a requirement. So it's mailboxes serving covered units have to be within reach range. And where this gets a little tricky is with the USPS, which have their own separate set of requirements. I believe they require the mailboxes to be minimum 28 inches above the finished floor. So when you kind of couple those two requirements together, you do have a pretty large mailroom if you have a lot of units in your project. Protruding objects is another area we see often in multifamily projects and elsewhere. Objects can't extend more than 4 inches into the circulation space between 27 and 80 inches above finished floor. So frequent protruding objects we see are wall-mounted televisions, fireplace mantles. Sometimes we see artwork, those types of things. If any of those stick out more than 4 inches, you should install cane detection below them. Similarly, head height underneath stairs has to be minimum 80 inches under the stairs. And if you can't provide that 80-inch head height, you should provide some sort of cane detection. So someone with vision loss can't just traverse underneath the stair and hit their head. Sinks. So in common use and amenity areas in Massachusetts, all sinks require knee and toe clearance for a forward approach. So, you know, anywhere you have a sink, if you have like a kitchenette or a bar in your amenity space, you need to provide the knee and toe clearance for a forward approach. The only exception to that would be if you have an employee break room, in which case you'd only need the knee space if you can't provide a centered parallel approach. And that gets back into, that's an ADA only requirement. not 521 CMR or the FHA. Tables and seating. So anywhere you're providing tables in a multifamily project or otherwise, you should ensure you're providing accessible tables and accessible seating areas. So an accessible seating area, the top surface is between 28 to 34 inches above the finished floor, with minimum 30-inch wide by 27-inch high by 19-inch deep knee and toe clearance. So think about it kind of like a rectangle underneath of those dimensions. 521 CMR has the more stringent requirement here, and it requires each type of seating to be accessible. So if you have a bar counter without service in a multifamily project, you need a lowered section of bar counter, as well as an accessible table if you're also providing tables in that area. Signage is also required per the accessibility requirements. In Massachusetts, emergency egress signage has to be illuminated and include the international symbol of access at areas of accessible means of egress. This is a common issue we see on Massachusetts projects of not including the international symbol of access. So that's something worth considering. Tactile braille signage is also required at all permanent rooms and spaces. So, you know, all your unit entry numbers, all your amenity spaces that are numbered and signed should have signs that have tactile braille, and they should be 60 inches to the center line of the sign. Pet spas are something we're seeing more and more on our projects. It's a good time to be a dog. So at the pet spa, you have to make sure you're providing door maneuvering clearances, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Turning space within the room. So you need 60 inches of either a turning circle or a T-shaped turn. You need a level clear floor space at the controls, and the controls within an accessible reach range. Something important to note about pet spas, though, it really depends on the tub specified for those controls. So, you know, in most cases, the controls for a pet spa require reach over an obstruction. And if that reach is between 10 to 24 inches deep over that tub, the controls can be no higher than 46 inches above the finished floor. So the height gets a little lower once you start having to reach over something. So that's important to note. Drinking fountains are something we see often on projects, either put in the wrong spot or not enough put in the correct location. So anywhere you're putting drinking fountains in Massachusetts requires a high-low type. So a drinking fountain for a seated user and a drinking fountain for a standing user. And the other thing you have to watch out for with drinking fountains is they're often protruding objects. If you're not, you know, either building them into a wall or providing cane detection on either side of them, they stick out more than 4 inches into that circulation space. So that's something to think about in your projects. Grill timers and emergency shutoffs are another area we see projects do a variety of things on. So you want to make sure if your grill timers and emergency shutoffs are intended for resident use, they meet that operability and height requirement we've been talking about. So operable with one hand without tight grasping, pinching, twisting of the wrist, and within an accessible reach range, minimum 15 inches above the finished floor to maximum 54 inches. So where we often see this come up is sometimes they'll tuck them underneath the grill behind a cabinet. So that usually doesn't work because they're low to the ground. Or the controls themselves can be like these tiny knobs that I have to like pinch and turn to operate. So you should really look for either a button style or a paddle style that I can operate with a closed fist. The last area I wanted to talk about relative to common use and amenity spaces are guest suites. So this is something we're seeing come up more and more across our projects. And if you're providing a guest suite, which is a place where if I live at an apartment, I can rent out this guest suite for my guests so they can stay over. If you're providing guest suites, you need to make them accessible, which is surprising to many because, you know, I don't know, it's just not something that's being thought about, but it requires an accessible bathroom, an accessible kitchen, door maneuvering, turning space, all of that. So I think this is a good question to ask your projects early on if they're planning on providing guest suites and what their plan is surrounding them. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about units. So unit issues are things that repeat a lot and can be where there's significant issues, because if you find something in one unit, you're going to multiply it by either all the units or how many units of that type. So it's really important to get your units right early. So the unit entry door has to be minimum 32-inch clear width, has to have operable hardware, a peephole, a compliant threshold, and maneuvering clearances on both sides. So here's my slide on door maneuvering clearances. So in 521 CMR chapter 26, you'll see these diagrams which show different clearance layouts for the push and pull sides of the door. So depending on the approach to the door, there's different clearance requirements and you have to make sure you're meeting them. A couple things to note are door maneuvering clearances in Massachusetts have to be provided within 6 inches of the face of the door. So you have to be careful if you have thick walls or recesses near your door. And the AAB considers spring hinges closers. So some of these door maneuvering clearances require greater depths and clearances if there's a closer. So I'm just sharing that information so you know spring hinges also would require those greater depths. The clear width of a door and maneuvering clearances are also measured from the base molding. So on the bottom right, I stole this graphic from the Federal Access Board, but I really like it. It shows a door and a yellow box that protrudes from the floor all the way up to the ceiling. And that's kind of the area where you would measure door maneuvering clearance. So if you have baseboard or shoe molding, that would be within that box, that would not be permitted. Maneuvering clearance, clear width is measured from the face of the door when opened 90 degrees to the opposing stop. So you want to make sure you have 32 inches at your unit entry from that face of the door open 90 degrees to the stop. Typically that involves a 3-0 door. Here's an example of something that happened on a job site where they had an unexpected grade change at the unit entry, and it created all these issues at the unit entry, these slopes, a non-compliant threshold, a lot of headaches. So again, reviewing these things early and often, I can't emphasize it enough. In the interior of your unit, your doors also need 32 inches of clear width, operable hardware, thresholds that are compliant, and maneuvering clearance. The exception to some of these, though, is in Group 1 units per 521 CMR. So again, majority of your units do not need the clear widths, hardware, or maneuvering clearances day one, so long as they can be provided without structural change. So those are something to consider. You know, some projects, if they have doors that don't provide the 32 clear width, have offered, you know, they'll use an offset hinge, or doors that don't provide the maneuvering clearance in their current configuration, they can swing the door in the other way and have it. That would be compliant only in a Group 1 unit. In the Group 2 units, those more accessible units, all of these things are required day one. Closets are a common area we see an issue with clear width. So closets greater than 24 inches deep need to have a minimum 32-inch clear width at the entry door. And that's because it's considered a walk-in closet if it's deeper than 24 inches per the accessibility regulations. Thresholds. So thresholds are an area that I have a lot of feelings about. I was recently involved in a long-standing litigation case where a bunch of properties across the country were reviewed for thresholds being 1/8 to 1/4 inch off. And when you think about it, an 1/8 inch in that tiny threshold dimension of a 1/2 inch is a significant amount. So I can't emphasize enough, watch your thresholds. At swing doors, they can be 1/4 inch vertical or a 1/2 inch if beveled at maximum 1 to 2 slope. At sliding doors, again, you can do that 1/4 inch vertical, or you can go up to 3/4 of an inch if it's beveled with a maximum 1 to 2 slope. You have to make sure you're watching your interior floor at your thresholds. You're not creating any slopes greater than 2%. And somewhere I'm seeing this come up a lot too is passive house. So there's a lot of projects in Massachusetts that are going for the passive house certification. Unfortunately, the threshold requirements are not frequently thought of, especially at balconies. So I'm sharing that now because there's nothing worse than when I get onto a job site when it's done and it's beautiful and their thresholds are all wrong and they have to figure out a plan to address them. So again, thinking about this early and often, I can't emphasize it enough. At balconies, on top of the threshold requirements, you're also permitted a change in level. So if your balcony surface is pervious, so water can get through it, so that would be decking or pavers, you're allowed a 1/2 inch change in level between the balcony surface and the unit interior finish floor. If the balcony surface is impervious, meaning water can't get through it, like concrete, you're allowed a 4 inch change in level from the balcony surface to the interior finish floor. And the reason behind this kind of significant change in level is the idea is you could build on top of it at tenant request, but you can't do that at a pervious surface. So that's kind of the difference there. But it's important to remember at your unit balconies, you're allowed the change in level and the threshold requirements. You need to meet both. So here's an example of a project that had an issue with balcony thresholds. They measured 1 inch from the subfloor, and then they decided to just throw a bunch of gypcrete right at the balcony threshold itself and created all these slope issues, up to 5.1% slope. So they ended up having to rip out the floor and feather that gypcrete far back, about 5 feet back, to gain the amount of height needed to make that threshold work. So, again, continuous reviews of these types of things prevents ripping things out that's costly and painful in the future. Accessible routes. So in your unit, you need a 36-inch wide accessible route to all elements, including the bedroom. You need an accessible route to one side of the bed, and the bedroom has to be capable of providing 60 inches of turning space. In your kitchens, you need 40 inches of clearance between opposing elements. This excludes hardware. So that's a common question I get, like, do I measure my 40 inches from the refrigerator handle or the face of the refrigerator? And the answer is the face of the refrigerator. So that's something important to just remember. If you have a U-shaped kitchen, you need 60 inches minimum between opposing elements. You are allowed to reduce down to 48 inches if you have removable cabinets installed at the base of the U. So, the idea is if I can't provide that 60-inch turning space, if I do provide removable cabinets at the base of the U, I can reduce down to 48. So that can be helpful if you have a project that's being built in a really tight location. So here's an error we saw in construction, the plans note 40 inches between the face of the counter to the opposing range, but then when we got to the fields, it was only 38 between the island and the counter. So that is an issue. So again, constant checkups on these things, even though the drawings had it right, you know, things change. So keep an eye on it. Kitchen clear floor space. So sinks, ranges, and cooktops require a centered 30 by 48 clear floor space for a parallel approach. So you can see that approach in the top right hand side. So you have that 30 by 48 dimension with the 48 dimension centered on that appliance or fixture. Refrigerators, ovens, and dishwashers permit the clear floor space to be either centered for a parallel or forward approach. So you can either orient it so the 48 is centered on the appliance or the 30-inch dimension. So it's appliance dependent. And here's an example of an appliance that was designed incorrectly. So here we have a range next to a refrigerator, and the refrigerator protrudes out beyond the face of the counter in the range. And that refrigerator protrusion obstructs the required clear floor space at the range appliance. So these are things to, again, just watch out for. Removable cabinets are not required unless you can't provide a parallel approach for the FHA. It would only be required at sinks. The AAB requires all cabinetry to be removable, but their definition of removable is very broad, and it just says without structural change. So as long as I can remove those cabinets without structurally changing the building, that would be compliant per 521 CMR. So here, removable cabinetry is more stringent for the FHA that requires easily removable cabinetry when you can't provide a centered parallel approach, and that would only be at your sink. AAB has a bunch of requirements for group 1 units. We talked about sink depth earlier, so 6.5-inch maximum depth for all sinks, unless you get a variance for the group 1 units. If you have wall ovens, the floor of the wall oven has to be 30 inches above the finished floor. And refrigerator doors have to be capable of opening 180 degrees, or an adjacent 30-inch counter is provided. Your group 2 units, which are, again, the more accessible units, require the sinks to be 6.5 inches deep, which, again, is required. And for the group 2 units, the AAB does not frequently give variances for those, so those should be 6.5 at construction. A wall oven is required in the group 2 units. You can't use a range appliance. And the floor of the wall oven is required to be 30 inches above the finished floor. Cooktops are required because, again, you can't have the range appliance. And refrigerator doors, again, have to be capable of opening 180 degrees. They have to provide an adjacent 15 inches of counter space, and the freezer floor has to be maximum 44 inches above the finished floor. When 521 CMR was written or last updated in 2006, bottom freezer type appliances were not the status quo yet. So if you want to use a bottom freezer appliance in a group 2 unit, a variance is required. Electrical outlets. So in your unit, all your outlets have to be compliant per 521 CMR and the FHA. So 15 inches minimum to the center line of the lowest plug. So a common question we get is, where do you measure the 15 inches? And it's to the center of the lowest plug. Similarly, 48 to the highest operable part. So the switch in the on position, 48 inches. In Massachusetts, all outlets have to be minimum 18 inches from an interior corner. The only exception to that is the unit entry switch, which can be centered horizontally on the wall. So here's some examples of construction errors where we see, over a counter, the electrical outlets have to be maximum 44 inches to the center line of the highest plug in Massachusetts. So here we can see that, this is a 36-inch counter plus 11, so that's more than 44 inches. Thermostats are often spec'd at 48 inches to the center line, but if you have buttons above that 48-inch center line, that would make it so the thermostat is not compliant. We frequently see outlets and switches too high or too low, especially at balconies. You should be measuring from where the pavers or the finished surface is going to be installed. At kitchens, 44 inches to the center line of the highest receptacle is required per 521 CMR, and that 18-inch minimum from an interior corner is required per 521 CMR. In addition, the FHA requires a minimum 36-inch outlet over L-shaped counter section. So anywhere you have an unbroken piece of counter that turns 90 degrees, you need at least one outlet somewhere over that counter section that's minimum 36 inches from the interior corner. This can be really difficult to meet with the overlapping electrical code and the 18-inch requirement per 521 CMR. But I've seen projects do it. Some projects choose to go for a variance for this condition. So these are things just to think about. The last thing about electric is panel boards. So if intended for resident use, the panel boards have to be 48 inches to the highest operable control and minimum 24 from a corner for group 2 units and minimum 18 for group 1 units. In group 1 units, you can locate the electrical panels in other locations if you have sufficient wiring to relocate it in the future. I've been doing this for over a decade now. I've never seen someone put wiring to relocate an electrical panel, but it is an option to you. You could be the first. And then the last set of requirements we're going to go through is toilet rooms. So all toilet rooms, regardless of whether they're required to provide clearance layouts, which we'll get into in a minute, are required to provide blocking. That blocking has to be 32 to 38 inches above the finished floor. And it should be 12 inches high if you're going to use a swing down grab bar. So for toilets, it should start from the interior corner to 6 inches beyond the widest part of the toilet. And this is, again, for the future installation of a grab bar. So all the walls should have this blocking. So if a resident requests it, they can put a grab bar. Similarly, the sidewall should have the blocking from the interior corner to 6 inches beyond the face of the toilet, or minimum 36 from the rear wall, whichever is larger if you have the space. Tubs require reinforcement on all walls. For group 1 units, it's 6 inches above the tub rim to 48 inches above the tub bottom. In group 2 units, it has to be 60 inches above the tub floor on all walls. A common issue we see is the tub controls being in a location where the future grab bar will be installed. So if you have a tub control located between 33 to 36 inches, that is the typical location of a grab bar. That could be a potential issue. I know there's a building inspector in Massachusetts flagging this. So keep it in mind in your projects. You can put it below the grab bar or above. Showers require reinforcing on all walls, 6 inches above the finished floor to 48 for the group 1 units. And for the group 2 units, it's all 3 walls, 60 inches from the floor. So a little bit more stringent for those accessible units. And then this is the part of the slideshow that is kind of, it's difficult to explain, but stick with me. Bathrooms are notoriously confusing. So this graphic, I think, helps sum it up a little bit. So in a group 1 unit per 521 CMR, you need at least 1 common bathroom and all captive bathrooms to meet the clearance and layout requirements. Per FHA, you can either have one spec B bathroom, and the way I think of this is spec B is better, or all of your bathrooms meet spec A, so A for all. And you have to kind of overlap the spec B, spec A with common and captive per 521 CMR, and it gets really confusing. The other thing to note is in your group 2 units, all bathrooms and half baths are required to comply. So that is the most stringent of all of these. So let's talk a little bit about spec A and spec B. So a spec A bathroom is here on your left. You're allowed a forward approach to your bathing fixture, so that 30 by 48 with the 30-inch dimension flush with your bathing fixture. And you're allowed to have your sink at any height. And if you want to go with either of those options, forward approaches to your bathing fixtures or sinks higher than 34, then you can meet the spec A requirements at all your bathrooms and not worry about this. However, if you have multiple bathrooms in your unit and you have a sink at 34 inches and a parallel approach at your bathing fixture, then that bathroom meets spec B and the other bathroom is not required to meet the layout requirements. The other bathroom would still be required to provide reinforcing and the door clear width, but not clearances at the fixtures. So it's important to kind of acknowledge the spec A, spec B, but generally 521 CMRs, captive and non-captive, are a little more stringent. But one place that FHA is more stringent is clear floor space. So FHA requires in your spec A or spec B bathroom a 30 by 48 clear floor space beyond the swing of the door, where 521 CMR allows you to swing the door in a different direction at tenant request. So that's something to keep in mind, is if they are using a spec A or spec B, you need that clear floor space beyond the swing of the door day one. So here's a picture of a non-compliant shower or bathroom we've seen where they don't have that 30 by 48 beyond the swing of the door. It's obstructed by the toilet, the door swings into it. I can't fit that anywhere without hitting something. And the idea there is so I can have space to park a wheelchair and then close the door. So it's pretty important. Toilet center lines, when you're next to a long wall, it has to be 18 inches finite to meet both FHA and 521 CMR, and 15 inches minimum to an adjacent lavatory. Note, if there is an adjacent lavatory or fixture next to it, it cannot extend more than 24 inches deep. If you have a toilet next to a bathing fixture, it should be 18 inches to the chase wall. So that 18-inch rule kind of applies everywhere, and that same 15 inches minimum to the lavatory or short wall also applies. So here's a bunch of examples. Toilet center lines are something we see often get a little askew. So, you know, the top left picture is showing you they don't have the 33 inches clear, so 18 plus 15 at your toilet because of the sink overhang, so they had to cut that back. And then in the bottom picture, you can see a toilet center line at 19 inches and not 18 inches, so that would be flagged. In your group 2 bathrooms, there's a bunch of requirements for the toilets. So the 18-inch rule still applies for the toilet center line, but you also need 42 inches from the center line to the adjacent lavatory or whatever's closest to it, and 42 inches from the front edge of the toilet to the opposing wall. The seat has to be between 15 to 19. The flush has to be on the open side. And if you have a toilet paper dispenser, it has to be minimum 19 inches. Lavatories need a clear floor space. And if you can't provide a parallel 30 by 48 centered on the fixture, you need easily removable cabinets for a forward approach. So that means the floor, walls, sides are all finished so they can be easily removed. Tubs, 521 CMR is generally more stringent here. You need a 30 by 48 parallel to the tub for a group 1 unit. However, if you're using FHA Spec B bathrooms, the FHA Spec B requirements is that clear floor space is measured flush from the control wall. So it is a little more stringent in that FHA would require it to be measured 30 by 48 flush from the control wall, whereas 521 CMR is 30 by 48 with the 48 anywhere along that tub. So that's just something to keep in mind. And in group 2, your tubs need a 30 by 72 clear floor space with 12 inches beyond the drain edge of the tub. And it can't overlap other fixtures. The mixing valves of your tub have to be centered on the long wall at 28 inches above finished floor. Showers have to be 36 by 36 minimum. And they require a 30 by 48 parallel clear floor space, both centered on the fixture per 521 CMR and measured flush from the control wall per FHA. So this is a common area we see come up in Massachusetts, where in the drawings, they'll spec a 48-inch shower pan, which looks great. If I measured this out, if I was reviewing the plans, that would meet the minimum dimensional clear floor space requirements. However, in the field, once they add finishes, if you use a 48-inch shower pan, those typically do not provide the required 30 by 48 with the 48-inch dimension measured flush from the control wall. So in the right-hand side, you'll see a picture where, they notched out kind of a few inches at the foot end of the wall. So that way they guarantee their 48 inches of clear floor space. This is an issue we see come up often in litigation. So I highly recommend reviewing your shower clearances. And if you have 48-inch shower pans, think about how are we providing those clearances. It usually involves notching out a piece of the wall. Group 2, you are required to do a 30 by 60 or 36 by 60 with a wing wall shower. It's a roll-in type. It must be fully open on the long side, maximum 2% slope in the shower, and the curb has to be a 1/2 inch high, beveled with a 1 to 2 slope. And the mixing valves have to be centered horizontally on the long wall. Yeah, and now we're at our recommendations. So hopefully that wasn't too overwhelming. And like I said earlier, I'm sharing all these requirements so you will think about them. Next time you look at a shower, maybe you'll think, hey, there's something weird about clear floor space. And that would be a win in my book. But I also have these recommendations for your projects as you're going forward. Number 1 is think about accessibility early and often, especially at the initial planning phases. Number 2 is budget for accessibility. I can't emphasize this enough. It's often we'll get calls from clients way too late in the game, and scrambling for budget later on is a challenge. Establishing protocols for when third-party accessibility reviews are required is something we highly recommend. You can set a protocol for projects of certain sizes or scale to just make sure someone's thinking about this. Attend trainings. I have another slide I'm about to share with a bunch of resources for that. Ask for help. You'll have my email as well as a bunch of resources you can reach out to for help with all of this. Ensure the architects, contractors, and inspectors are reviewing for accessibility. It's everyone's responsibility to be frequently checking for this. And perform routine construction visits to monitor and mitigate conditions in the field. So as you saw, there's lots of areas for issues to arise. So, it's not enough just to do one plan review. It should extend the whole life of the project. And now we've made it to our Q&A portion of the session. But before I open the chat and start reading questions, I did want to share this slide of resources that you have available to you. Mass Office of Disability is wonderful. The MAB, you can call them. They'll provide free technical guidance. The Federal Access Board, Fair Housing Accessibility First, the New England ADA Center, BCIL, local independent living centers, and if you have a local disability commission, I highly recommend you reach out to any and all of these resources that are available to you because they are invaluable. Okay, so great. So now I'm going to go through, I see a bunch of questions in the chat, and I am also going to share, again, if you're looking for the AICP CM credits, please don't forget to fill out the sign-in sheet as well as the evaluation form that are linked in the chat. All right, so the first question is from Jim Kelly. Do emergency exits from public spaces have to be accessible? Can you explain the different? Okay, so let's start with that question. So emergency exits would go into you'd look in the accessible routes section of 521 CMR. And generally, if you are at a level of exit discharge, so you have a level that has a door that leads outside, you need at least 2 accessible means of egress to the outside. So that is important to look at. And then if you're on an upper floor, there are requirements also found in Chapter 20 of 521 CMR. So you can please look at that as well. And then the second part of Jim's question is, can you explain the differences between Group 2A and Group 2B and why there's an A and a B? Great question. So Group 2A are kind of the more adaptable version of the Group 2 units and would apply to market rate multifamily projects. Group 2B are the fully adapted units. So they require the knee clearance day 1, whereas a Group 2A would allow you to have removable cabinets, for example. And a Group 2B unit would be found in a transient lodging facility, so like a hotel or a dorm, where the residence is less permanent in nature. So those are kind of the ways to think about it. And we do have a lot of projects choose to meet the 2B standard, even though it's not technically required. So like a lot of affordable housing projects choose to do 2B day 1. So that way they can mitigate any potential requests in the future for adaptability. But, you know, it's kind of project dependent. But Group 2A is market rate. Group 2B is, again, transient lodging, requires grab bars, removable cabinets, day 1. Jim Kelly also asked, is accessible seating at a bar with service required? That is a great question. So no, per 521 CMR, if you have a bar with service, so I'm at a restaurant and there's a bartender and I can purchase food and drinks at this bar, I do not technically need a lowered section of bar counter per 521 CMR, so long as there is an adjacent accessible table. Now, the caveat to that is the ADA would be more stringent here. The ADA standards would require, you know, the different programs within the restaurant to be accessible. So if that bar is like a typical bar where, you know, I can go grab a drink while I wait for my table to be ready, and it provides a different function than the table seating, then the ADA would require a lowered portion of bar counter. So I would, you know, keep that in mind as you're reviewing bar projects, depending on where it is. And if the bar doesn't have service or doesn't have a bartender, it's just like in a multifamily amenity space, you are required to have a lowered portion of bar because it's a different type of seating, but, you know, it's not something where the service could be provided elsewhere. It's just a different function. So those are kind of the 3 different requirements to consider when looking at bars. All right, oops. And then Mandy asked, what is the min and max height for a peephole? That is a great question. I believe it's 44 inches in Massachusetts for a peephole. Peepholes are something that have a bunch of different requirements. In multifamily, again, it would just be at your group 2 units. And, you know, everything I'm saying today too, so all of the requirements I just said are the bare minimum. That doesn't mean like they're required day 1 at construction. That doesn't mean later on you may get a request for a reasonable accommodation in the future. You may get a request for a lower or higher peephole in the future. You can't say, well, I met the requirements, I'm not doing that. So just to keep in mind, these requirements aren't the end all be all. James Kennedy asked, if the Mass Plumbing Board grants a variance to allow 1 accessible bathroom where 2 would be required based on square footage, would that also require a variance from the AAB? Yes. So even though the plumbing board would say you only need 1 accessible bathroom, you still would be required to get a variance from the AAB because their requirements are separate from the plumbing board. Robert Frederico, in this day and age, I find it totally unacceptable that there are so many variables and requirements among the codes. Thank goodness the Mass Building Code and inspectors have only the Mass to enforce. I think that's just a comment. Thank you for that, Robert. Sarah from Mansfield is asking for the sign-in sheet. It's at the top of the chat, but I will link it again right now.
I think I did repost it.
Oh, awesome. Thank you, Carol.
Someone say if they can't see it.
Yeah.
And we'll take care of that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And probably not sure if you covered it. I manage conservation and plan out. Okay, so this question's from Karen, and she manages conservation and plans for outdoor spaces and wondering if there's any requirements for an accessible community garden plot, maybe a specification. So great question. So if you have anything open to the public, like a community garden plot, the general thing you should think about is it has to be compliant. So you would need an accessible route to that garden plot. If you're providing parking, you would have to provide accessible parking. And then any features within the garden plot that are unique. So if you have hoses or baskets or, you know, anything, I'm not a gardener, so I don't really know, but anything unique to gardening that someone would need to access, you would need to make sure those are on a route and within reach range and operable with one hand without tight grasping, pinching, or twisting of the wrist. So aside from multifamily, I do a lot of municipal reviews as well. And with community garden plots too, thinking about that accessible route and making sure it's stable, firm, and slip resistant is critical, because a lot of times we'll see kind of a sidewalk go to the door of the garden plot, but then once you're in it, it's all dirt or mulch, which would not be stable, firm, and slip resistant. So you should think about a route to at least one of the gardens in that plot. And then, oh, I see that.
There's a hand raised, Megan McNamara. I can unmute her if you like, Katie.
Great, let's do that.
Okay.
All right, thank you. So my question, and I'll sort of provide an example to sort of back it up, is there a general rule of thumb or maybe a requirement for an accessible route? And my example is, an outdoor staircase. We know where someone who's able to use that staircase would, go from the top to the bottom rather quickly, but someone who's requiring to use an elevator would require going back inside a building to take that elevator down to get to that same location. So I'm sort of wondering, is there, a distance that might be too long where, you know, a disabled user has to go to get to that same point?
Great question. So generally it has to coincide with the general accessible route for the public. So, you know, if you have a stair, the accessible route, I should be able to see it plainly from that stair and know, obviously, this is the way I go. My worry sometimes about the situation you explained where I have to go in a building and use an elevator is that building open 24/7 like the stair might be? Is it, you know, locked, or is there any sort of security feature that would make it so only some people could use it? And how far is it from that stair? You know, is it like I can see it from the stair, it's really close and obvious, you could put some directional signage, or does it require like me knowing the building and navigating some different place? So if it's not totally obvious or, you know, adjacent to that stair, I would recommend a variance from the AAB.
Okay, thank you very much.
And you have a new question in the chat.
Great. So from Jim Kelly, can you speak again on the required accessible parking in a garage under multifamily? Only 12 parking spaces. Okay, so did you say those must be made accessible if requested? Yes. So if you have a parking lot with 12 spaces, 521 CMR Chapter 10 for multifamily common use spaces is going to say all of those spaces must be capable of being made accessible at tenant request. So you should look at the heights, see if you have van clearance, and if you don't, I would request a variance for that. You'll also have to ensure minimum 2% of those spaces are accessible per FHA. So it's kind of both those overlapping requirements. All the spaces have to be capable per 521 CMR, and 2% of the total number of spaces have to be compliant per FHA.
So there's another chat question, and I think there was a hand raised as well. So you can take your pick. Maybe the hand went down. So the chat question, I don't know if you can find it, says, does a stone dust path meet requirements in lieu of impermeable surface?
So stone dust paths can potentially meet the stable, firm, and slip resistant requirements. They have to be very compacted, and my worry about stone dust paths is maintenance. They typically require a high maintenance level of maintenance to maintain that stable, firm, and slip resistance. So, you know, it's annual compaction and review, and it may be more frequent than that. I don't install these myself, but it is a maintenance issue for sure. But it can be a potential accessible surface. Awesome. Does anyone else have any questions, comments, concerns? Oh, I see another. Jim Kelly. All right, a little off topic. Can the 60-inch space allowance for accessible wheelchair spaces and bleachers protrude into the aisle? So that's a great question. So generally, it cannot obstruct the accessible route. And sorry, Jim's talking about assembly spaces. So you have to have adjacent wheelchair spaces if you have bleacher seating, you need accessible wheelchair spaces at your bleachers, kind of notched out and integrated into your bleachers. So he's asking, can the wheelchair space protrude into the aisle? So not if it obstructs the accessible route or an emergency egress path, and not if it like fully blocks the route, right? Like everyone's going to be bumping into this person. If they're sitting in this spot, that would not be ideal. The other thing to consider for those seating spaces is they are required to have shoulder alignment. So the wheelchair space, the shoulder of the wheelchair person has to align with the shoulder of the adjacent companion bleacher seat. So that's something to keep in mind because typically it requires the notch to be cut a little bit further back. And you can look at the ADA standards for the specific dimensional requirements on that.
Katie, I want to thank you so much. I'm a little bit deer in the headlights now, but it's one of those subjects where you learn a little, you realize that you need to learn a lot more. So I'm thanking you very much, and I feel like we do need to try to think on my staff about how we're going to incorporate some type of review for. Yeah, you said everyone's responsible, and I think that's an important take-home point for me.